Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, a warm welcome to our international roundtable, where we would this time like to deal with or ask the question, is there a need to rebrand human trafficking? And the issue will be the interface between migration, human trafficking, and slavery. We are very pleased to be here at the House of the European Union, and therefore I would immediately like to ask the representative of the European Commission in Austria to take the floor and to greet the participants. Thank you very much that we can be here. Mr. Bogensberger.
Good morning, distinguished experts, guests, high-level people from all over the world. It's a real pleasure for us to host these several roundtable discussions in the premises of the EU House. I would wish you a very warm welcome on behalf of the representation of the European Commission and the Information Office of the European Parliament. It is in particular a pleasure for us to have this event in our premises because it's both important and highly relevant in these days, and in particular the subject matter focusing on the interface between the various facets of human trafficking, be it looking at the links to migration, the links to one of the most topic issues these days is of high relevance. As you are well aware, there are differences between migration and trafficking in human beings. Once a migrant has crossed border, the essential element of human trafficking is that the trafficking, the exploitation situation continues, be it for exploiting labor force, be it in the context of sexual exploitation. And in addition, there is not a need to cross border, so there is trafficking in European happening even intra countries without having to cross borders. So it's very good to look in particular on this interface to identify the overlap and the common elements in order to better tackle this phenomenon, which is, and let's take it as it is, a serious crime. It's unacceptable to have such a sort of modern slavery in these days, in the 21st century, still happening in our societies. Just taking the opportunity to be the host of these roundtables, I would just mention the importance the European Union attaches to the prevention and fight against human trafficking. This is an issue the European Union has been busy already since the 90s, and it has since then developed a comprehensive legal framework. There is a directive approximating criminal law measures all over Europe. There is many activities in the context of prevention. There is an establishment of an anti-trafficking coordinator centrally. The EU has marked a specific day as the Anti-Trafficking Day. The EU runs a specific website, the anti-trafficking website. There is lots of training, there is lots of awareness raising, and in its external relations, the EU has always an issue on trafficking in European beings, be it in the context of the neighborhood policy, be it in the context of the relations to third countries. So this is quite obvious that this is a subject of extraordinary importance, and what is equally true and relevant, this is not something that should happen in books and in drafting of legislation. This needs to be implemented and transposed and used in practical terms. And this is one of the most difficult challenges to bring it down to earth, and that's one of the reasons where we are most grateful that these events happen here, because one of the issues is in particular how to deal with this phenomenon in practical terms, and how to protect victims, prosecute the perpetrators, and try to prevent this sort of severe violation of human rights to the utmost extent possible. So I would like to wish these roundtables very fruitful discussions and as much success as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This roundtable is organized in the framework of the Regional Implementation Initiative on Preventing and Combating Human Trafficking. So the focus is on implementation. But of course, we don't do it alone. So we do it together with multipliers. Therefore, you are here. And we also hope that we will have fruitful, and for sure we will have critical discussions on the issue. This initiative is supported by Austrian government, by Austrian ministries, by the Austrian government, not by all of them, but some ministries, and those ministries which support the Regional Implementation Initiative are also dedicated to the issue. So one ministry would be the Ministry for Labor, Social Affairs and Consumer Protection, and another one would be the Ministry for Women, and another one, the Ministry for Health. So issues which we would also like to discuss at this round table, looking at women, looking at the health implications, looking at the labor side, etc. And but most of you might know that at the moment there is a very busy time in Austria. We have elections in 2 weeks' time, and so the minister wanted to come, the Minister for Labor and Social Affairs wanted to come, but he's now prevented from coming, but he sent a video message, and I would like the technicians to start the video presentation of Mr. Stöger, Minister Stöger. We don't hear anything? Okay, maybe we start again. We have now, this time we have 2 technicians. I hope this is not to the worse, but to the better. Can we start again?
Tireless work in this field over the years.
Can we start again?
We all agree. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation. Unfortunately, I am not able to welcome you personally, but it's my pleasure to contribute to this important conference with a video message. This international roundtable is organized by Helga Konrad, our former Minister for Women's Affairs. As you know, the aim of this annual event is to exchange experience and improve cooperation between international practitioners and experts. Therefore, I would like to thank you, Helga, for your vital contributions and tireless work in this field over the years. We all agree that human trafficking still is one of the most pressing human rights issues. It is a serious crime which demands effective and well-coordinated counteraction at all levels. Human trafficking is often addressed within the context of sexual exploitation. Clearly, this form of trafficking will have to remain high on our agenda. But there are other purposes for human trafficking too. One is labor exploitation, which often includes slavery-like practices. Therefore, combating and preventing human trafficking, especially for labor exploitation, has to be in our focus. We take a range of different measures in this regard. For instance, we tackle the root causes of human trafficking by fighting poverty and social exclusion and by promoting equal opportunities, social justice and social cohesion. I am very grateful to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming here today to contribute to our joint effort and find common solutions to prevent human trafficking. I wish you all a productive conference.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. So what is important in the fight against human trafficking, you all know, is also politicians who care. This is important, and he's one of the ministers, also in another position. He was a former Minister of Health, also in this position. He understood the importance of a coordinated and comprehensive approach to human trafficking, and he was also always very supportive. By the way, there are several representatives of the Ministry of Labor, Social Affairs and Consumer Protection here with us today. I would now like Ines Stilling, the Director General, Women and Equality of the Austrian Ministry for Women and of Health, to take the floor and to tell us why this is important for your ministry and why you have decided to support the activities.
Dear Helga, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Human trafficking, and especially trafficking of women, is of high concern to my minister and to our ministry. The Ministry of Health and Women Affairs is not only a member of the Task Force Against Human Trafficking and thus participates in the joint efforts to improve policies and legislations, but also sets own initiatives. My ministry, as ministry responsible for health issues, as Helga Conrad said previously, the adequate training of the various health professions is considered of major importance. Victims of violence turn to the health system more often than they turn to the police or counseling agencies. Hence, training is needed to raise awareness among health professionals that they might encounter victims among their patients and to recognize signs of violence, physical exploitation, and hidden work accidents. Furthermore, it is necessary to establish clear procedures for how to react in case of suspicion, including the securing of forensic evidence and the referral to appropriate counseling centers. Therefore, present efforts focus on integrating the issue of violence and awareness of especially vulnerable groups into the curricula of health professions. As ministry responsible also for women's affairs, a special attention is given on comprehensive support of female victims of trafficking. Since almost 20 years, the Ministry of Women Affairs finances the Intervention Center for Trafficked Women jointly with the Minister of Internal Affairs. It is centrally responsible to support female victims from the age of 16 upwards in Austria. The comprehensive support given entails, among the others, emergency housing, counseling on all relevant aspects, psychotherapy, and assisting during court proceedings. About 250 women were supported by the Intervention Center last year. To offer counseling to victims is of high importance, but we are all aware that fighting the causes of trafficking is of the most important issue. Precarious living conditions always are the root of trafficking, and migrant women who had to flee severe economic circumstances in their home country or even war are especially vulnerable. Hence, we need not only increased awareness of the special vulnerability of migrant and asylum-seeking women, we also need to create effective counteractions. To my opinion, the most important one being the integration of those women in our society. Among others, this includes the necessity to cooperate with the relevant migrant communities even more closely, and that's why I'm happy that some of those are here today. I hope and I'm sure that today's really wide-ranging program will highlight many challenges and offer the possibility to discuss strategies. Many thanks to you all for contributing to this really important dialogue, and dear Helga, for your continuous work in this really hard field. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your support. Thank you, Ines Stilling. Let me mention that today we are linked via live stream with the whole world, I would say. I know that in Australia, for instance, they are following, students are following what we discuss today. I know that our experts and stakeholders in Russia, for instance, are following. I know that in the US, there are people following our discussions here in other EU countries, of course, in South Africa, for instance, just to mention a few. So I would like now to mention that we have a few partners. It is not just the partners from the street, let's say. No, it's chosen, very well chosen partners for the initiative and for the roundtable. We have here to give you an example, we have CEPA, the Center for European and International Policy Action. We have the director of this think tank here, a think tank who is located in Brussels, also to underline our link, and we would later on like to hear from you about the European approach. I mean, we heard something of what is there, but we must also admit that, as you already mentioned, Mr. Bogensberger, that the implementation is a weak point. So we are going to discuss what the EU can do more and can do better, also with our help, maybe. We have as partner the EU strategy for the Danube region. She's not here, but represented also by the Vienna Office for Human Rights. Vienna is a city of human rights, so we go also down to the local level and would like to see what at local level might be contributed to it. And we have Act Now as partner. Act Now has recently started, or some time ago started, to focus on exploitation and focus on children. So also something we are most interested in, and it's an international acting private enterprise. So I would like to ask Mr. Bedlenfalvy, Katrin Neumüller, Shams Asadi to take the floor and to tell us why the issue we discuss is important for you, and ask you to, from your point of view, to tell us what is important about it. And we would like to ask the question whether, in the connection with migration, we have to be aware, we have to accept that human trafficking is a collateral damage, you know, or if we really have to accept restrictions of human rights, as some politicians said. And last but not least, I would like to mention Ambassador Vuk Cugic from the OSCE, more precisely from the economic and environmental activities of the OSCE, who recently started to focus on the issue of to discuss the economic aspects of it and to discuss what the resilience of cities and communities vis-à-vis migrants. So please, would you be so kind and take the floor? And I would immediately ask Ambassador Cukic to take the floor. Please, you come here, and the others, would you join me here at the? Yeah. The micros are on, by the way, so no need to switch on or off. The micros are on afterwards, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I will try this morning in a, let's say, short presentation to bring to you the activities of the OSCE in this field, because we believe that the topic of today's meeting is a very complex one and urgent. It is complex since we are facing increasing political challenges in dealing with the governance of migration flows, and it is urgent because the costs are borne particularly by the most vulnerable ones. This complexity has also been recognized last year on the Ministerial Council in Germany and Hamburg, when a decision on the OSCE role in the governance of large movements of migrants and refugees were adopted. Considering how the migration scenario has changed rapidly and in unpredictable ways, migration governance is one of the most dynamic policy areas. According to the Migration Policy Institute, one of the leading international think tanks, increasing barriers to the legal entry of migrants reduce circularity and return, pushing migrants into permanent settlement. At the same time, in order to keep the right to reside legally in the countries of destination, which is strictly linked to employment, migrants are ready to accept lower wages and fewer safeguards. Regrettably, as the ILO analysis show, this trend is endemic, particularly in those sectors less regulated by labor laws where migrants are mostly employed, and such as construction, agriculture, domestic works. This overall scenario progressively pushes migrants at the margins of the labor market, and as you know and as we know, social dumping practices produce detrimental effects on the working conditions. In these trends, we see the interface of migration and human trafficking and increasing threats to social cohesion as well as to security of states and individuals. And this is also another reason why at the same Ministerial Council in Hamburg, the OSCE participating states adopted another decision on strengthening good governance and promoting connectivity, calls on participating states to strive for better application of international labor and social standards and to increase efforts aimed at overcoming challenges such as labor exploitation and poorly regulated and inspected work sites. Being the largest security regional organization under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter and guided by the comprehensive security approach, OSCE is aware of the risk of poorly governed migrations. Contrary to conventional wisdom, more human mobility is part of the solution. Prevented from moving along legal and accessible channels, migrants will continue searching their way through the only available alternative, asylum requests, recurring to the increasingly expensive services of smugglers and traffickers. The overburden of the state mechanism to process asylum claims turns to be detrimental for the genuine refugees. That is why legal migration policies must complement humanitarian responses. During the last year, and discussing this issue, the OSCE executive structures have carried out in-depth stock-taking exercise regarding the OSCE role and activities implementing the various areas related to migration governance, from legal migration to border management, from migrants integration to trafficking victims protection. The final report of this exercise calls for a comprehensive and holistic approach to address human mobility. Fostering legal migration as a critical measure to prevent human trafficking is an integral part of such effort. To this end, the OSCE is renewing its engagement to promote a balanced, evidence-based dialogue where the complexities of migration governance can be properly addressed. Indeed, the same global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration includes in the same document commitments to facilitate legal migration together with measures to curb trafficking and assist victims. While the Office for Economic and Environmental Activities has been carrying and training and capacity building activities supporting to the labor migration to the participating states, particularly in Eastern Europe and Mediterranean, the Office of the Special Representative for and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings is actively engaged in a simulation exercise where all relevant stakeholders are involved in concretely investigating live stimulated cases of trafficking. At the same time, ODIHR is mapping promising practices for migrants integration at the local level. And this is just a snapshot of what the OSCE is engaged in. In light of all of this, allow me to conclude by sketching some areas of action where the OSCE, and including the Office for Economic Activities, in particular, is focusing the most at the moment. First, to reinforce legal migration schemes, not only for labor reasons, but also for education purposes. Second, support the socio-economic inclusion of migrants and refugees. Third, provide people with opportunities in their home countries by improving the business climate of countries of origin. Fourth, develop deeper insight into migrants' behavior through innovative research in order to identify suitable measures to prevent the exodus, particularly of young people, and make return as a possibility. But most of all, to stem any rise in xenophobia, we will continue raising awareness through public discourse that migration has become an integral part of our global economic environment and that it contributes to economic growth and social development in the line with the vision of the Helsinki Final Act and the OSCE commitments. It is obvious that we need to build a new narrative of migration to support proactive and positive responses, and we are planning to discuss this topic later on during this year in December on the occasion of our annual meeting to mark the International Migrants' Day. There is a strong need to reverse the current paradigm and make migration one of the possible choices in life rather than or now or never option leading to trafficking. And I believe that the current complex situation offers a great opportunity, the opportunity to reinforce our cooperation. Acting in an interconnected world means that unilateral approaches cannot provide suitable solutions. This is the reason why now more than ever there is a strong need for multilateral mechanisms. Our organization is eager to continue playing its role as a regional multilateral platform for dialogue, building bridges between participating states and other regions for a more prosperous, peaceful, and inclusive society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. Maybe you take the floor here. Maybe if you can stay a little bit with us, we would also discuss the role of international organizations in the fight against human trafficking. You mentioned very important issues, but as we started saying today, important is the implementation. You know, to put it on paper is one thing, but then to implement it is really a challenge, and the international organizations certainly have an important role to play in this, providing information, also background information on what is going on and doing research in this field. I didn't mention that you had a number of very high positions, you know, as Ambassador of Serbia, to the Republic of India, for instance, so you have also extensive experience outside of Europe, and maybe in the discussion this can also be taken into account. And you were the OSCE, the chairperson of the OSCE Permanent Council during Serbia's OSCE chairmanship, and you had other important position at the OSCE. Let me tell you because maybe it will also take too long to introduce everybody, and everybody with all the merits, you know, and all the experience they have. Let me just mention that we have this information at our website, and you find short bios of our experts at the web page. Okay, I would now like to ask maybe Shams Asadi. She is Commissioner, Human Rights Commissioner of the City of Vienna and the head of the office, the Vienna Office for Human Rights. And maybe you can tell us what does it mean that a city, you know, like Vienna is a city of human rights? What does this mean? What do you do? Where are your limits? But what are your perspectives? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and it is a great pleasure for me to be here from a local level and from Vienna as a host city of such a great conference, and of course as a cooperation partner. Vienna is a human rights city. Maybe you know it, maybe not, but it's not very important. We had the first World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. It was 1993. And then afterwards, every 5 years, there is a conference that it takes differences in the world into consideration, what has happened during this time. And then it was 2013, again, we had the conference 20 plus in Vienna. And then during this time, it was just, we were very aware of that the most of the population of the world, they live in the cities. Even if you look at to the Europe, it is 75% of the population of Europe, they live in the cities. So taking human rights in the cities into consideration, maybe it's not that new, because in the first conference, it was a point that human rights could be considered or could be implemented at the city level. But as we know, it takes time in order to implement. And then we are, since 2014, a human rights city. The question definitely is coming, what does a human rights city do? A human rights city does the whole policies and strategies according to the human rights or from the perspectives of human rights. And then we took 3 pillars, and then those 3 pillars are equality and non-discrimination, and then we have participation. And if there is just some lack of awareness, just empowerment is very important, and transparency. On the line of those pillars, we defined with the NGOs and with the whole communities and with the whole conferences that we had for our our focus points, and are just defining our points that we have to just work on these points. And then human trafficking is something that, the Office of Human Rights Office has been commissioned through the City Council of Vienna to take this point into consideration. Just we have the right of the child, or we have security policies from perspective of human rights, or we have awareness building and consciousness rising in the city, but human trafficking is one of our most important points. What we have done since 2 years in this field, all of us, we know the Greta from the Council of the Europe, the report on different national levels, and in these national levels we have points that they are very tailor-made, or just the blind points that each federal provinces they have in countries. And then we started to look at the blind points that we have in this report. And we started our work, and we work with our partners. We have a focus group. We have a LEFE, maybe Evelyn Props, she's going to talk about that. And then we have the academical level here. We have the different departments in the city that they are in healthcare or in children or just women's affairs. And then we work, all of us, the city government and city administration, we have to take some steps that we not only combat this problem, but also prevent human trafficking. And then, of course, support.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shams. And your assistants gives me sign that the ambassador will have to leave soon. So, but there are others, other former ambassadors of the OSCE here, Margit Westfeld, for instance. So we can further discuss the discussion. We can further discuss the issue with others if you have to leave. But again, thank you very much for being here. So I would next give the floor to Katrin Neumüller. She is CEO of Act Now, and maybe I would like to, or participants would like to know why does a private enterprise, focus on this issue? What is the reason? What do you do, and why is this so? Please, Katrin, you have the floor.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for coming, and we are very honored to be cooperation partner with Helga on this occasion. Act Now was founded in 2016, so we are a very young organization. It was founded by a group of private people on the occasion mainly of the refugees coming from Syria to Europe, and the feeling that most of the national governments and also the EU they were acting quite helpless. And most of the work done was done on the grounds. So the idea was to interconnect those people from then Jordan, Lebanon, over Turkey, Italy, Greece, up to Germany, to interconnect the mayors who do work on the grounds, who receive people in their communities, in their municipalities, with the NGOs, with international NGOs, with local NGOs, with experts from the academic field, but also with people concerned with refugees themselves. So there was a conference organized in Vienna called the Now International Conference, and that was in January 2016. And then this organization was set up with the idea to keep on going. There was another conference in July 2016 in Greece on the EU-Turkey agreement. And in the last conference, Now conference in January 2017, we started focusing on children. The title was then Children Under the Radar, because we had the feeling that children, as the most vulnerable group, also the ones that are not really specially treated. I mean, there are institutions doing it, but as a topic, they were not treated, really. So we started focusing on that. We just came back from having a conference in Kampala on African youth and migration in Uganda. And we think, and we also started to have now working groups, steady working groups that work throughout the year on trauma, on education, on gender, and also on exploitation. And this is where we more or less come together, because we think that all these issues are very important, and the way we treat the children, the way we receive them, the way they arrive here and have a life will shape the future. Our future and the future of the upcoming generations, the way they experience their life, their chances or not chances, will shape our future. So this is very important. And that's about it.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, I would like to ask Director Peter von Bettlen-Falfy on behalf of SEPA, let's say on behalf of the European institutions, to tell us how he sees the situation in the European Union, in the European Commission, what could be done better and more. So you are a think tank, you challenge the European institutions, so please tell us about your situation. SEPA, by the way, is for quite a while a partner of the Regional Implementation Initiative on Preventing and Combating Human Trafficking. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Helga. You must know that Helga Konrad told me to be critical, but then she reconsidered. She told me be critical of the European policies, but keep it to 2 minutes. You don't have more than 2 minutes. So in 2 minutes, I can say some compliments, and then the critical points, I have to leave them out, unless you don't
let out the
agree.
compliments.
But of course, I have to see also that, and we have to be aware that Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin are watching us. I mean, this was your implication. And Mr. Trump is probably not sleeping at this time because it's quite early in the morning. But I'm aware of it, that it's a very important conference. And now, to the trafficking, I have to say just a few words about the history of this city and Helga Konrad, because it was basically Helga Konrad and her, at that time, colleague minister, Federal Minister for Interior, Mr. Einem, who helped at the very moment the European Commissioner, Mrs. Gradin, to launch the first conference. And Ambassador Bogensberger knows it probably very well, that it was just across the street in the Palais Auersberg, where we didn't have neither air conditioning nor heating, and it was a summer time, and we were locked in this big room, all the governments at that time, and Helga insisted with Mrs. Gradin, don't let anybody out, lock the door. And so I was there sort of as a guardian, and I said, what do we do with the people who would wish to go to the loo or to wash their hands? And then Mrs. Gradin said, well, there is no exception to it. They have to understand trafficking is the issue for the future. So coming to that, I'm very grateful to Helga Konrad and to the federal ministries to invite SEPA and invite organizations such as I've seen Mrs. Sørensen, the former member of the European Parliament, who is the director of PAOKI, such organizations to participate and to be active. Helga Konrad, of course, participated in a number of discussions we had in Brussels with the European Commission, with the Parliament, and with the governments, with some ministers on terrorism and foreign policies, and of course trafficking. So now to the issue, Helga also asked me to address a few points which are worth to analyze for political and for practical reasons. As you know, the migration agenda has been just yesterday, thanks to Helga, improved in Estonia. All our ministers and head of states, they have done another push, given another push for the new migration agenda of the European Commission. And here I have to say there are a few good things in this agenda, and but also there is the old omelette, which we know, which is being cooked and baked for several years. The good thing is that you start to feel that governments realize migration is a complex issue, first. Secondly, they realize that we have to actually, if we deal with migration policies, we have to include the so-called transit countries and the countries of origin. The third is we realize, the governments say, we realize that if we don't do anything, then extremism, xenophobia, separatism, nationalism will rise in Europe, and there will be different political parties, so we may lose our mandate. So those are on the good side. The other partly good side was that what to do, Helga. You asked about the implementation, and you said that the implementation, and you also mentioned implicitly, the implementation is sometimes lacking. We are very good in good words and in good declarations, and good papers and nice words, but implementation is sometimes difficult. So what happened, just in short, you may know, because Helga is devoted with her heart for the civil society and the work of NGOs, in which I believe as well. And she asked me also to say, to say something how the work and the value of the protection of the victims was translated into the policies in the aftermath of this irregular, illegal migration crisis which we experienced since 2015. You are right to put the finger on it, that the migration has almost swallowed the trafficking. The only major reference to trafficking was by the High Representative, or if you like, today, to our representative of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Morganini, who said, we have to destroy the boats of the traffickers. And the second thing was that the NGOs were asked for more assistance, but there was no concrete point, because it was realized by the governments that we have to act globally, and this was translated by more or less by the European Commission into the terms of funding activities of 2 or 3 international organizations, one of them for which I worked for long years, IOM, and UNHCR, and this meant automatically that NGOs are less being asked for activities in the countries of origin and transit. Global action means translation, give money to the international organizations. This is good on one hand, I'm not criticizing it, but it's also bad, because these large sums of money now given mainly under the aspect of security is essentially a phenomena which has to be sort of critically discussed. One understands that terrorism, irregular migration, and the events of the past years have, as you said, have caught the European Union in a cold, very cold situation. We do not have, as yet, consistent and common migration policies, and we don't have a common asylum system. And this is just what Mr. Macron said. It's one of his main speeches now, that we have to develop something. And this point is, insofar I'm speaking about this, is important, because the NGOs have to be taken into consideration when it comes to the question of human rights and good governance. In the past speeches and declarations of the leaders of the European Union, prime ministers and presidents, you find very little about good governance and rule of law and democracy. You find a lot of words on the security, on prevention of illegal migration, on border protection, etc. But the point, Helga, which you raised, yes, I think that our leaders have to be reminded that there is a question, there is a commitment, as Ambassador Wogensberger said, to the human rights, fighting for the protection of the victims and not just deliver speeches. And I'm not going to finish it now, but giving you just a few practical examples that if Mr. Juncker, as the President of the Commission, speaks about solidarity and sharing burden, he could have said, well, let's have, for example, a quota, as you said, for the children out of the crisis situation, or let's have a quota for the victims of trafficking, but not just banging, let's have a quota on distributing asylum seekers. Somebody could have said it amongst the politicians. This would have been not too difficult. As regarding the, and I finish because you said I should not criticize too much. We are hosts here in this house.
We come back
of
again
the European
later,
Union. Yes, we have created the position of the, you are right, Ambassador Bogensberger, the position of the European coordinator. But the European coordinator is, has also a leadership function, a function to show the way forward. So I would have, and we would have expected to say, yes, the NGO community, or during one of our annual meetings, let's address the question of solidarity as regarding victims of trafficking. Let's take a quota in the European Union. Nobody would have been punished to say that, but if I'm correct, nobody said it. So we have more examples of that, and I don't want to continue, but again, to finish on the positive side, I would say that this call of irregular migration of 2015 has woken up the governments, and I still have a hope that something very common on the European level, something very positive will come out. It's a hope, and we are living of hopes, Helga, and you do it as well. So I thank you very much for this opportunity, and I finish here, I promise you.
Thank you very much. We shall come back. Thank you, Ambassador. We shall come back later on the issue of security versus human rights, and if we years ago, it's not only now during this so-called refugee and migration crisis that we mention that migrants in general are very vulnerable and easy prey to traffickers. It's a long time ago, you know, at least I did it 20 years ago, you know, we told them, look, just closing borders is not a solution, you know, not a solution to human trafficking, not to others, you know. So, and this narrow approach, this narrow security approach is part of the problem, really, you know. This is what we are going to discuss anyway later on. And I know that you will stay at the conference, Peter, and in the ways forward later on after the discussions, maybe we can ask you again what you think what could be done at European level, and of course we will also discuss what others, let's say the NGOs, but also IOs, etc., also law enforcement, you know, can contribute. We have, for instance, a representative of Frontex here. This is really a challenge, yeah, to discuss this, and we will see if we can contribute to a better understanding, and maybe also to a change in the attitude towards these issues. Okay, so thank you very much. I would ask now, I would come to the we would now like to come to the issue which we wish to discuss, and I would like to ask Mike Dottridge to come up here. I would like to ask Fabrizio Sarica from UNODC to come up here, Jutta Henneberger, please, and Ulrich Nachtelberger. Oh, he's here, I haven't seen you before. So, with regard to Mike Dottridge, you know, he sometimes, he's a long-standing expert we are working with, and he sometimes, you know, says when I ask him or we ask him to focus on special issues, he would say, well, don't you think that the people find it boring always to have my face and to listen to me? And then I tell him, not at all, because this is also the difference from our round table to other discussions, let's say. It's not just looking always for somebody who delivers something and then that was it. No, on the contrary, together with many of you, we just try to make a difference, to develop better approaches, maybe new creative ways of how to handle the issue or parts of it. And we would like to give the multipliers who follow us also the feeling, and we want to let them know that they are not alone, you know, when they go back in their countries and are confronted with something, you know, some ways of addressing the issue, so at least they would know there is a network. I would also like to encourage you to take advantage of our network, so you can address all our experts, and you can also invite them to your country, to discussing in your country special issues. So this is the way way how we would like to do the things within the Regional Implementation Initiative and also with this roundtable. Okay, having said that, we come to our first item. We would like to discuss modern-day slavery versus human trafficking. So why? Maybe you all realize that for quite some time we all discussed human trafficking. You know, we were very glad to have finally, you know, the UN protocol. We have the global reports. We have also the Council of Europe Convention, and we had the notion of human trafficking. And nowadays, if you look what they report, by the way, in the light of this, or in the shadow of this migration and refugee crisis, there is not much to be heard about human trafficking, you know, about anti-human trafficking. It's all more on migration. But very often, politicians also go now with, and it depends on the countries, you know, in the US, for instance, more, in UK, more, they go with the notion of slavery or modern-day slavery. And we would just like to have a closer look at it, to see whether it's all the same, it doesn't matter, it's just words, or are there concepts, certain concepts behind, and what concepts these are. And of course, we would also, this is also a very recent issue, we would like at the money, you know, we call it manipulation a little bit, because those who have the money also decide about the agenda, you know. They decide what is important, what should be done, how it should be done. And this panel would have a sort of critical look at it. And I ask all the panelists and all the speakers to give me one sentence, you know, which would at least, I ask for a provocative sentence, you know, so that it would stimulate also discussion, and what would be the main issue they would like to discuss. And Mike Daughtridge, he's international expert and consultant, has worked for really many years on this issue, and he said, efforts to rebrand human trafficking as modern slavery appear to be another attempt to waste time and money in Western countries on developing neat theoretical concepts instead of focusing energy on stopping unacceptable exploitation. And he added, isn't it really about the egos of some particular people who want history specifically to acknowledge their contribution? So this is what he said, and we are eager to hear more about it. So you have the floor.
Why don't you sit down for a moment?
I will yeah.
And talk from here. Let's see first if we can make the technology work. And I wonder if you can see the slide I have with a nice blue background. I'll leave it to our technicians to see if they can put up. There's only one slide to look at, so and there's no hurry. You can wait a few minutes. So as you know, it's almost 20 years since the diplomats sat down here in Vienna to draft what became the UN Protocol on Trafficking in Persons. And it sparked off a lot of changes that we've discussed at previous roundtables. 20 years isn't a long time, so it might appear premature to now be trying to overthrow the anti-trafficking system and replacing references to trafficking in human beings by a less legalistic concept of modern slavery. However, this is exactly what numerous organizations and states are now pushing for. And as this new term gets media attention, mainly in English, and relatively little in Europe, I want to brief you on what's going on. Although I was director of a non-governmental organization with the name Anti-Slavery International in the 1990s until 2002, I want to explain why I consider the term modern slavery inappropriate and divisive. And I want to explain mainly that it's because of the people who are using it and how they use it, rather than the legal concept of slavery that bothers me. This term, modern slavery, was proposed in the United Nations back in the 1970s, when it was considered and rejected for a minor UN working group that ended up with the more lugubrious title of the Working Group on Contemporary Forms of Slavery. The term was put to use elsewhere, as in the title of an eminent NGO that is represented here from Paris, the French Committee on the Eradication of Modern Slavery. Absolutely acceptable title for their work to release migrant domestic workers held in captivity in apartments and houses around Paris. However, after the UN Trafficking Protocol was adopted in 2000, an academic who I'd worked with in the 1990s, called Kevin Bales, went on telling everybody who would listen that the patterns of extreme exploitation around the world should be called slavery, not trafficking. And here I'll just refer you, you can't see the bottom of this slide, but it's got a number of names and arrows, and hopefully bottom right will reach some events in the United Nations last week. Kevin said everything should be slavery, and he was one of the one of the trustees in the NGO where I was director. He then went to the USA to set up an NGO there, and his breakthrough to convince other people to talk about slavery came when he met the richest man in Australia, Andrew or Twiggy Forrest. And he was inspired some 8 years ago to start spending some of his spare millions of dollars, most of which had come from exporting minerals to China, to start spending them in an anti-slavery campaign. And in 2011, he set up a new foundation called Walk Free in Australia. He consulted Bill Gates, who told him that in order to influence or eradicate something, you must measure it. So you must measure slavery. And that same year, Twiggy Forrest started a process which now leads to regular reports about the number of people in slavery in the world. In 2013, they published their first global slavery index. And the same year, Mr. Forrest announced that he would contribute $10 million towards what was planned to be a $100 million freedom fund to combat modern-day slavery. His donation was matched initially by $10 million each from two other philanthropists, one of whom you probably have come across, set up eBay on internet. So 30 million they started with, they've had a few more. Now, I ran anti-slavery in the 1990s with a budget of less than $1 million a year to begin with. So for me, the idea of having $40 to $50 million to spend even over 5 years, wow, you could do a great deal with that if you tried and used the money properly. Starting in Australia, the Freedom Fund was then moved to London, and it has its headquarters there, but still impacting more outside Europe. In 2014, Mr. Forrest proposed setting up a public-private initiative, a global fund to end slavery, and he offered now $200 million to start it if governments would match his funding. And initially, governments were wary, but the International Labour Office took the proposal seriously. And finally, this month, the money started flowing in. The US government allocated $25 million, and the United Kingdom has announced £20 million. So with two government donations, $43 million euros in that fund so far. It's intended to finance national plans to eradicate modern slavery, so-called, in 50 countries with the worst patterns of exploitation, starting, it was initially suggested, with Ghana and Nepal. In announcing the grant, the US Secretary of State referred to modern slavery for the first time instead of the term in use in US circles, TIP, or trafficking in persons. And the ILO's support comes in the form of Alliance 8.7 concerning the Sustainable Development Goals. And last week at the UN in New York, 37 states in the UN General Assembly backed a call by the United Kingdom for action to end forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking. And interestingly, only 6 of those states were from the European Union. It didn't represent a European Union initiative. Now, many of you will know that Walk Free has published further editions of the Global Slavery Index in 2014 and 2016, substantially increasing its estimate each time of the number of people in modern slavery. In fact, almost doubling its first estimate by 2016. This month, the International Labour Office cooperated with Global Slavery Index to produce a new global estimate of the number of people in both forced labour and forced marriage, totaling 40.3 million people. 24.9 million in forced labour, 15.4 million in forced marriage. The numbers are always newsworthy, but don't be dazzled by numbers, for underneath there are all sorts of other more important things going on that you should be aware of. 2 governments have really picked up this issue of modern slavery. First, my own, the United Kingdom. You can't imagine that a right-wing conservative politician in the United Kingdom should want to revert to the right-wing anti-slavery politicians of the early 19th century and grab this issue of slavery and create a sort of halo above their heads. The United Kingdom persuaded at the very last minute the United Nations to include a reference to modern slavery in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is why we have it in 8.7, and the ILO is running an alliance supporting 8.7. The other government that has picked up on this issue is Australia, otherwise known to be the most hostile, I would even say one of the most major violators of human rights of refugees and asylum seekers. And they're currently holding hearings to see whether they should adopt a new anti-slavery act in the way that the United Kingdom did 2 years ago. Now, I'd better say a few words about what is meant by modern slavery, particularly by these governments and these rich philanthropists. For it's not a term in modern law. There is no modern equivalent of ownership of individuals. And I'd better admit my personal involvement, for at the time that the UN trafficking was being developed and adopted, I was involved in a review of international law on contemporary forms of slavery, and we published that review in 2002. This referred to the 2 UN conventions on slavery and practices similar to slavery, dating from 1926 and 1956, the ILO's various conventions on forced labor and child labor, the new UN trafficking protocol adopted in 2000, and also an earlier 1949 convention on the exploitation of the prostitution of others. So, although there was no legal concept of contemporary forms of slavery, it had some formal development in the UN system. What then is the harm of using the term modern slavery, if it's just an alternate way of referring to what the UN calls contemporary forms. Let me share with you some of my personal concerns. First, Westerners, not anyone else in the world, seem keen to apply the term to a wide range of practices that they see happening in developing countries, while human rights defenders in many of those same regions think the term slavery is inappropriate to apply to the exploitation occurring under their noses. For example, in South Asia, where bonded labor accounts for millions of people, the anti-bonded labor activists are convinced that condemning it as slavery will not help hasten its demise. Secondly, the term slavery implies that the countries said to have large numbers in modern slavery are allowing something awful to occur, as they are. But instead of the paradigm concerning development and cooperation that was dominant in the second half of the last century, when richer countries supported efforts to bring about social and economic development in poorer ones, we now revert back to a 19th century notion that some countries are uncivilized, requiring pressure from outside to abandon unacceptable practices, perhaps with gunboats again. Even if I buy into the concept that extreme forms of exploitation are completely unacceptable, I can't support the suggestion that evangelizing missionaries from a small number of rich countries are an appropriate method to bring about change. And here I won't even comment on the fact that many of these evangelizing missionaries are white men, once again stalking the non-white parts of the world. My third worry is that using the term modern slavery pushes us into a name and shame mode. We point the finger at governments or at businesses which tolerate it or are not deemed to take adequate action to stop it. This is sometimes an appropriate reaction, but it's not a sound basis for international cooperation. Fourthly, in the minds of people in Western Europe and in the Americas, the term slavery refers to the transatlantic slave trade and the 400-year period when Africans were taken captive, transported across the sea with high mortality rates, enslaved, routinely tortured, worked to death, or killed. There is a real danger that using the same term to refer to levels of exploitation which are horrible but which do not meet the legal definition of slavery has the effect of trivializing or relativizing historical slavery and thereby reducing any sense of responsibility for the countries that profited from slavery. This fits neatly into the agenda of white supremacists. This brings me to my fifth and deepest worry, that the governments that have decided to use the term modern slavery, particularly Australia, the UK and the United States, are ones which appear keen to abandon conventional approaches to development and rather happy to seek to impose change from above. This year, Australia and the UK started using bullying tactics at international conferences to persuade others to follow their usage. Notably, when there was a debate at the UN Security Council last March about trafficking, slavery, and forced labor, and again at discussions in Strasbourg concerning Greta and the Council of Europe Convention. This problem is linked to the question of human rights. The rich philanthropists who finance anti-slavery organizations, or some of them, are not keen on human rights. They certainly don't feel bound to implement anything called a human rights approach. Mr. Forrest has been relatively outspoken on this point, though more so in the context of action concerning Indigenous Australians, which he himself supports. concerning charitable donations to Indigenous Australians, he's trivialized human rights, implying that human rights somehow allows forced marriage and claiming that our culture, our Australia, can't abide this. I'm afraid his use of words reminds me of how various dictators that I visited in the 1980s used to play with the term human rights in order to belittle fundamental human rights principles. 3 years ago, when the United Kingdom was discussing a new law, a new modern slavery law, my worry was that using the term slavery would mean that people that really needed assistance, people who had been trafficked, would not be recognized as slaves because the term is so extreme. And I also worried greatly that the terminology was preferred by governments which really didn't want to do the right thing in terms of amending their policies, their labor market management policies. And so fundamental anti-trafficking and anti-slavery measures such as regulation, workplace inspections, formations by workers of associations to defend themselves, all of these are not associated with slavery and can be ignored on this right-wing agenda. And this fear that the term modern slavery puts a focus on exceptional situations rather than what is in fact something of a norm in developing countries. This threat, I think, was already being borne out when I look and listened to the debates in the UN Security Council, which of course focus on modern slavery or trafficking only in the situation of armed conflicts, such as that in the territory held by Daesh in Syria and Iraq. Finally, then, we can see that the term modern slavery has sparked division in the United Nations. It's reignited Cold War battles, this time with the former Soviet zone leaping to the defense of the term trafficking in persons, in which Belarus in particular has vested a lot of interests. And indeed, just at the moment, there is a debate on this issue again going on at the UN in New York. So my feeling is that moving on from the term human trafficking has opened Pandora's box, and I don't think this has been helpful. Now let me conclude here by saying that I've been an active critic of the way the concept of human trafficking has been developed and applied. I'm not in favor of allowing this issue to be dominated by police officers. So I'm not in favor of one term over the other. However, having seen a poor legal definition of human trafficking oblige me to spend some 10 years explaining to other people what it means, I'm reluctant to see yet more time and money wasted on disputes about concepts, legal and otherwise, instead of investing in action to stop unacceptable exploitation and to assist the victims who are in urgent need of assistance. For the moment, the solution I propose is to invest as much as possible in developing effective methods to stop extreme exploitation, but also to avoid supporting terminology which sounds imperialist and potentially racist. Primarily, in my view, the actions we need is to encourage governments to amend existing policies that allow or even encourage extreme exploitation to occur, policies which dominate the agenda at the moment of every European Union state. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. By the way, the introductory remarks of Mike Dottridge will be sent to you and also available at our website, because I guess already it will not be the only time that we discuss this issue. Thank you very much. And just because you can see that several people are concerned about what is going on. I have the permission, to quote an investigative journalist from the US. I mean, it's really a harsh critique, but I would nevertheless, just mention a few sentences on it, because she talks about this global index reports. They are not based upon ongoing empirical evidence, she says, based on those attached to the US tip office, which has proven since 2000, based upon state Deputy Inspector General investigations, to be dubiously collected data. Those involved are the same today who are continuing to push the same data with a new face, but not sane, empirical, or sound. Same, she focused also on this global, as she calls it, the global slush fund to date. You mentioned this global fund. They have proven transparency and accountability. Matter of fact, depending upon the fund, there is a high finding of 50 to 70% of the monies donated engulfed in fraud, waste, abuse, bribery, and mismanagement. They are not getting to those little NGOs on the ground who actually do the work. So this investigative journalist, yesterday, she sent this yesterday because she knows that we have this discussion. It is nonsensical, she continues, for foreign governments to give to the global fund to end modern slavery when it is a known fact that human trafficking exists in every country of the world. For those advocating for this monstrosity of yet another global slush, created to be a middleman banker, it is clear that human trafficking is in motion to be hijacked for political agendas, which is morally wrong. If foreign governments donate to the fund, they should give to the NGOs inside their own countries instead of giving to a US-led global slush fund, when the US is one of the largest donors of this slush fund. With no transparency and accountability, the mechanisms must be outside of the fund, etc., etc. So this is really a harsh critique, but it simply shows that people all over the world, just find it strange what is going on. So much money spent to something where those working on the ground have not the feeling that they can benefit from it, or that they can use it for really trying to come to grips with human trafficking. So we are, of course, like always at our roundtable, we are a bit behind schedule, but let me, before we have a short break so that you can network and ask and talk and whatever, so let me just come to the panel we have here. We have Ulrich Nachtelberger. He's a judge. He was the first in Vienna, in Austria, saying, well, I would like to focus on would be a specialized judge on combating human trafficking. But what he said, we also asked him to give us a sentence, and he said, it is necessary to overcome stereotypes of victims and offenders in order to carry out effective and fair trials. So we don't expect a presentation, we would simply discuss it, but of course we are curious to know what you mean by, we have to overcome stereotypes of victims and of offenders. This is one issue. I would let me just continue. We have here Jutta Henneberger. She's prosecutor in where? I forgot, sorry. Yeah, in Germany in general, but you're in one of the, in Koblenz, yeah, sorry. Division of Criminal Code, Special Part, Federal Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection in Germany. And she said the term modern slavery is not precise enough, this is interesting to hear this from a prosecutor, to be used for concrete commitments. The UNODC protocol contains a clear definition of trafficking in human beings. There is no need to blur agreed definitions. We will see if you share this view or not. And last but not least, we have Fabrizio Sarica from the UNODC. He's the team leader of the research team on trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. He works also on the global report on trafficking in persons. And it's clear, of course, that he would say, well, with the protocol we have, this is something we should use. Yeah? And he said, we do need definitions to measure the phenomena and to make sure that we speak about the same issues. But the question is, do we speak about the same issues? How much space is there for whatever interpretation? So I would like you just to comment, on what Mike Dottridge said from your point of view, and to explain a little bit why you have the position you have. Please, I would like to start with you. No, you shouldn't. It was switched on, so don't switch it off, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I don't know if I have a lot to add to this more or less political discussion about rebranding, trafficking as slavery or not. But what I can say is that as a judge, as a 100% practitioner, I'm not an academic, I'm not a politician, nothing like that. But we as practitioners, we're always happy if we have very clear rules to use. And we are not happy with amendments of legal provisions every year. Because you need to deal with these provisions every day. We need a development of decisions of Supreme Court to use, to deal with it, to everybody has to know what he's dealing with. And if you change the law each year, if you rebrand it all the time, so there is no time for continuous practical way of dealing with these cases. So I would, even if I'm not happy with the trafficking provisions we have, but I wouldn't be much less happy with a complete new branding of these provisions.
And what do you mean by stereotypes of victims and offenders?
This is, as I'm a practitioner, this is my practical point of view. I'm not a hunter. I'm not an investigator. I'm not a police officer, or sheriff, or what else. I'm a judge, and the role of the court is to obey the law, to obey the legal provisions, to obey the criminal procedural code, to take care of a fair trial for all people involved. And on the one hand, if it comes, there's no difference between a car accident or a fraud case or a trafficking case for us. But if you are dealing with these trafficking cases for many years, like I do now, there are some specificities. So we have, on the one hand, as I told before, legal provisions which I'm not completely happy because it's a bit complicated to use. And on the other hand, we have very, very complex cases, and they are overlapping with pimping. They are overlapping with labor cases. They are overlapping with criminal organizations and so on. So it's, or at least you can see all these cases as economic crimes as well. So they are very complex. And if it comes to victims, that's my experience, that they are very often investigated just focusing on the victim, making an interrogation with the victim, and then bringing the case to court, especially if it's on sexual exploitation. And this is not sufficient because these people are traumatized, they are in a very specific situation, they are very often live in this symbiotic relationship to the offender. So, and you have to consider that if it comes to trafficking cases, lay judges are involved in the decision, and you have to present them the case, and they have to decide together with the professional judge. But lay judges are involved, and they have a vote. So, if you bring a case to court just relying on a victim's statement, this is very dangerous. So I always say, please investigate on a very broad level, investigate with wiretappings, investigate with observations, investigate with observing money flows, opening bank accounts, etc. We need hard facts. Yeah? That would really lead out in proper convictions, and not relying on the victim as the weakest piece in the whole chain of evidence. Yeah? And overcoming stereotypes is what I said. They often live in a very, very symbiotic situation with the offenders. Their interest is very often not a sentence and not a punishment of the offender. So we have, from my point of view, I really would like to keep out the victims of the criminal proceedings.
Yeah, most interesting. We will discuss it later on because we have others, you know, from the Comité contre l'esclavage moderne and others to discuss this. And I know also, of course, in the audience, you know, participants who would have a say in this. Let me ask Jutta, what is your experience, you know, on this? Is it easy, you know, to be a prosecutor on the issues of human trafficking? Is everything fine, or are you pleased with the judges in general, or would you ask them to do better, to do more, whatever? Please, just comment.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Does it work? Okay. Yeah, Helga, thank you very much. I would like to mention that I'm here as a prosecutor, but in the first line as a representative of the Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection. So we deal with amendments and legal amendments. And what I'd like to mention first is, as you all know, there are several levels of directives, conventions, and slavery, human trafficking. It's not a versus for me. It's slavery is a part of human trafficking. And I would like to say I fully agree to what Mike Doddridge was saying. We think, the government thinks, that we don't need another term. It's not necessary to invent another term, modern slavery. We have the European directive with the definitions. We have the convention where we also have the definitions, and we have the UNCTAD protocol. So it is absolutely not necessary. And as you mentioned, Mr. Doddridge, the side event of the United Nations, which happened now in New York, there were several side events in New York dealing with modern slavery. And one you mentioned was that call to action of Great Britain. Great Britain invited the member states of the European Union and other state parties to appraise it. With the German government, we decided not to appraise it, not to be part of it. It was a very high-ranked meeting. They asked for Madame Merkel or the ambassador, and we said no, because first, we don't need it. It's really not necessary. The term isn't clear enough. You cannot lay provisions on that. You cannot transpose that into national law. So what do prosecutors need first? As you mentioned, we need all investigative measures. We need enough staff. We need more policemen. We need more time and more stuff. That would be the best.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah, and for the moment, last but not least, Fabrizio. So, what? Are you satisfied? I mean, of course, you know what you have done with the protocol, etc., and with the global reports. But on your global reports, we realize that human trafficking is not diminishing. You know, so it's there. It's increasing. So, what? Is there something we can do also from your part, or do we simply have to live with it? You know,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helga. Of course, as you are all aware, UNODC is the guardian of the protocol, so it's an instrument that is very dear to us. I can only repeat actually the concept that already been discussed in this panel. We in UNODC are the first to get frustrated with the implementation of the protocol. We, of course, would like to see more victims assisted, well, less victim trafficked, more assistance for the victims, more protection for the victims, more traffickers prosecuted. And but the point here is changing the paradigm. Is this the solution? How is going the implementation also on other sides? The trafficking protocol entered into force in December 2003. We, for the Global Report on Trafficking Persons, we also measure the implementation, for instance, on the legal point of view. And in December 2003, when the protocol entered into force, we had around the world 33 countries with a legislation, with a criminal offense in place, criminalizing trafficking as described in the trafficking protocol. Nowadays, after less than 15 years, we have 160 countries. So the number of countries with a criminal offense, with a common agreed definition of what is trafficking, quintuplicated. And I think this is a great success. I don't think there are many offenses, even homicides, have, let's say, is a crime that have different definitions around the world. In the case of trafficking persons, we have a common agreed standards. And this work of having legal instruments around the world, the same legal instruments around the world, did not come alone. I mean, it was not something that individual member states, individual governments decided, yeah, we should have this criminal offense in our legislation, and we should use the trafficking protocol. No, it's been the work of hundreds of different international organizations, not only UNODC, but OSCE, IOM, many other international organizations around the world. There's been the work of international NGOs, of local NGOs lobbying their national authorities to ensure that their own country had a legislation and that this was used. We had different waves of adoption of the trafficking protocol and introduction of the legislation. You may remember in the beginning, the first years between 2003, 2006, we had many European countries changing their legislation, adopting the trafficking protocol and introducing the trafficking definition in their criminal code, and then we had all the others. More recently, we have, for instance, all countries in the many countries in the Middle East, many countries in Southern Africa adopting, introducing the criminal offense and having the trafficking protocol as reference. And of course, this was not, let's say, the only thing, because not only we instructed or we helped, we supported a national authority to amend their criminal codes, but this came with trainings. How many trainings have been conducted, carried around the world to use the trafficking definition, the trafficking offense in a proper way, you know? So trainings, we trained judges, prosecutors, police officers, we trained border guards, even parliamentarians to use properly the trafficking protocol. So is at this point in time, after just 15 years, changing the paradigm, changing the definition, changing the concept is the response to the issue of lack of implementation, of few prosecutions or few convictions, or rather what judges and prosecutors have said, we need more resources. So probably the answer is governments, member states, authorities need to set human trafficking as a priority. Not only in the press, but also for real. Giving practitioners and also social workers, not only law enforcement from the law enforcement side, but also from the social workers side, the resources they need to combat trafficking.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, we didn't expect anything else from your side, but thank you very much. And it's good to mention that. A few comments, questions, whatever from the floor, and then we please, yeah. First you, then you. Do we have a micro, a mobile micro? Just a moment, you get one so that we can hear you. No, it should be on.
Hello. Okay. I'm from the United Kingdom mission to the United Nations here in Vienna. I just wanted to come back with a few comments because unfortunately the panel has spent quite a lot of time attacking the policies of a small number of countries, including my own. And just to kind of set some minds at rest. We're not seeking to redefine any existing international instruments. The Modern Slavery Act in the UK refers to the offences of human trafficking, slavery and servitude, fully in line with the Palermo Protocol and all other existing international legal definitions. So we're not seeking to redefine any of those in international fora. So there's really nothing in those accusations. In the UK, we use the term in two ways, neither of which is a legal way. It's not a legal term. We provide a more comprehensive operational response to these issues. The National Crime Agency in the UK has raised all those offences under the Modern Slavery Act, one of its top priority areas, and is running operational intensifications resulting in over 300 arrests in comparison to earlier years. We've also invested a further 8.5 million in policing and have extended powers to some of the authorities involved to have more effective action on the ground. We also use it as an advocacy tool, the term modern slavery. It's not a legal term. For example, one of the biggest newspapers in the UK is running a campaign on modern slavery to help members of the general public be able to spot the signs of exploitation, servitude, and all the other offences that we have under the Modern Slavery Act. I think some of the accusations that have been made are slightly unfair, considering that our focus both domestically and internationally is on driving action on the ground. And yes, we have increased our international funding to over £150 million of international development funding to address this issue globally. And I've already mentioned how we're doing that domestically. And I can't quite see how the UK committing to fighting this problem on the ground should be attacked. And frankly, there's been some conspiracy theories about white supremacism, racism, and I think this panel would be better served talking about the real issues on the ground rather than what we see is a distraction. We're focused on the issues on the ground, and we're not interested in having prolonged debates on terminology, which we don't think is the real issue. And frankly, I would hope that the increased funding and the increased work that we're doing should be applauded rather than attacked. Thank you.
Yeah, but it's not on attacking. This is our way of discussing it very openly. And it's not, we would like to discuss, we would like to see whether the words we use, whether slavery, modern-day slavery, all this mixture together, whether this is helpful in coming to grips with the issue of human trafficking and exploitation or not. So I'm very grateful that this was so clear and outspoken, because all this, you know, diplomatic discussing or whatever, nobody understands anything, you know, especially also politicians just use it, you know, they use this or that and have no idea what, many of them, you know, no real idea what is meant of it. So please continue to be quite open. This is our format, our structure here. It's not the UN, it's not the whatever, you know, official speeches. This is, we have already overcome that, because we do this for so many years and would like to be very clear, open, and discuss it, you know. It's maybe, you know, it's wrong, you know, or we learn, we all learn, you know. It's also us, you know. It's not we know and we tell you. No, on the contrary, we learn from you and you from us, maybe, etc. So thank you very much for this. So there was another, yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Mirjana Tomic. I'm not diplomatic. I work for Forum Journalismus und Medien Wien. I organize seminars for journalists on international topics, and I also train in media issue, among others, Austrian diplomats. I have very specific questions on the numbers. I would like to ask Mr. Dottridge how these numbers, whether we are talking of slaves or not slaves, how they have increased exponentially. And I would like to ask Mr. Sarika, how do you get your numbers? Since one of the things I do in my trainings is to teach about or try to evaluate the sources. Which sources do you have? Is it the governments? If it is the governments, how do you check if they are not manipulating? How do you check that these sources are correct? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Please.
My name is Chava Bugayer. I'm NGO Vitzo. I have a certain question also related to the term modern slavery. When you think about women, and especially about children, that do not even know that there is another life, they are slaves. So don't you think if you reject this term completely, you diminish the harm done to them? You diminish their being really a victim of slavery.
Thank you. And maybe two more, and then I will ask the panel, and especially Mike Dottridge, to respond to it.
Thank you. As we started to work at the local level, I noticed that awareness rising is the most important point, because people, they are judges or they are politicians or from the international organizations, they know what trafficking or modern slavery is. But if you go to the city administrations, they have no idea. And then what we do really need is just basic information. And what if you have thought about slavery or trafficking, victim, what you could do? Is there any telephone number, or is there any just, I don't know, office or a unit somewhere? And they are the just basic structural or informational problems that we have at the local level. And I guess it is a time to speak more about the local levels.
Mm-hmm. And Mona behind. Yeah, and one more, and then, oh, yeah, there are many. Okay. So then we have to...
I'm coming from the Committee Against Modern Slavery. So we hold the name since 22 years now, and we have always this trouble with judges when we have such a name, and in legal terms we're talking about human trafficking, and we're going on the means, the actions, and all the precisions and details. So ourselves, we're living this all the time with each situation, not only in terms of debate, but even in the fact of the name of such an NGO supporting a legal case in the court, and then we go into this debate in the courts. But this was not my question. My question was to Judge Ulrich. I'm sorry, I will have troubles in the spelling of the name. I'm very sorry with this French accent. The question is that you were saying that we need to go into the bank accounts and real investigation. And parallelly, you're saying we need to have the victim out. But what about victims of labor exploitation in private homes, for example, where we have no proofs beside the statement of the victim herself? So for us, this is something that we're facing a lot with such. When we talk about network, criminal network, then we can go and find all these elements. But we would be very happy if at one point in the investigation on a particular individual situation like this, for domestic work, for example, they would go and look into back account about any money that has been paid or fine information from neighbors. But this is not happening because of the problem of being so much on the statement of the victim.
Okay, Daya. And Nora, and then Peter.
Thank you. Daya Wenke, I'm an independent researcher and consultant on child rights. I would like to congratulate you. I think it's been a very inspiring and enlightening panel. I would just like to make a comment from the child rights perspective, because I very much agree with the criticism of inventing new terms, new conventions, new action plans, and investing a lot of new money into that. Because I think that is simply the way, and the very limited way, we are working in national governments, in international organizations, at the level of the UN. These are new approaches to keeping us busy. Look at, for instance, the new Global Compact on migrants and refugees, which may have an added value for the migrant side. But on asylum seekers, we already have it. So I read this as a new bold commitment to safeguard the rights of migrants. But we already have human rights. So I think when we get to the point that we are at a terminal point with our limited approach to implementation, and when we don't know what more to do, we invent new ideas, new conventions, new initiatives to keep us busy. It would make so much more sense really to focus on the implementation of human rights. I think we have everything we need, we have already there. And in a way, I already think that the invention, so to say, of the trafficking concept was in the same tradition. Because let's face it, I think we know the definitions don't work. They are too complicated. They are understood by lawyers, by prosecutors and judges with a legal perspective, but they are not really understood and applied in the social field. So it leads to a lot of confusion. And if we're still training nowadays to try and make people understand what trafficking means, I think after 7 years we should reflect about the limitations we see there. And just as a final point, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child prohibits, of course, all forms of exploitation of children. And I always argue that trafficking is nothing more than an aggravated form of exploitation, because it is organized, it is planned, it is committed against children, and those are traditionally aggravating forms of crime in all penal codes. So if we had proper criminal laws against the exploitation of children in place, I think that would solve a lot of our problems. But unfortunately, we're still missing those laws, especially in the labor field. Thank you.
Thank you. Nora? Peter and then Susanne.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Nora Martin-Janko. I'm a social worker. I'm working on the sex work program in France at Médecins du Monde. And I would like to add something about what Mona said about what you said about Mr. Nachtelberger. You said about leaving the victims out of the court. I mean, I agree with you that you need more investigation, and often they're only the testimony of the victims as a proof, and that is not enough. But actually, I mean, from what I see, the victims are most of the time left out of the court anyway. So, I mean, in France, most of the cases of human trafficking that are linked with sexual exploitations are actually pimping cases, where the victims are not even informed that there's an audience, and they are not in court anyway. And the other thing about combating human trafficking, I think it's really important to empower victims. And if they are not present at any point of the procedure, how can they be empowered? And how can we stop this to keep happening? That was just my point from the field.
Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. Peter, and then Susanne.
Well, I just would like to say that I was very comforted with the statement of Judge Nachtelsberger. I felt very uneasy that we have judges who want to see the whole context. And you made the point, I'm not a politician, I'm a practitioner. I want to see the real case. And if we would have such judges, more of such judges in Europe, then I think that we would have less such cases. The ultimate point is here that we have a lot of judges, even in the European Union. I'm not going to mention countries who are completely corrupt for one or other reason. So it doesn't just concerns cases of trafficking, but serious cases of economic organized crime.
Can I take the microphone closer
so
that the others can
we would need more, and I'm completely seconding what was said. Definitions, we don't need more definitions. We have a definition. Nevertheless, the Palermo Protocol could be or should be reviewed in some cases, but this is another completely other story. Now, I also liked your statement, and everybody clapped you when you said, okay, we need more policemen and so on. The problem is here that this crime is a very expensive crime, you know, and finally you have the results where the journalist has asked the right question, what are the figures? Well, my God, the figures, I can tell you, the first figures of the European Union were I referred to Mrs. Gradin. She said, the journalists are asking how many. So one of my colleagues said, 700,000. 700,000, and since then, the 700,000 was everywhere in the press, no matter what.
I think it was 500,000.
500, but then we increased to 700. Okay, you are right. 700 came afterwards. But so the point is, we should be aware that it's a matter of practice. We have enough of the definition, and maybe we need more policemen. But if we start to do that, anybody in our states and governments will say, well, my God, this is a whole industry. I mean, for 5 cases, the Eurostat cannot even prove how many people or how many victims of trafficking. So this is the one thing. And as regarding the UNODC, I mean, you are right. I mean, it's a big success. But on the other hand, you know, some countries are different than the others, so they cannot adhere to the convention, but practices are terrible. I mean, you know it. So here we have political will against political non-will, or cultures, if you like, and we have to fight it. But it doesn't mean that we need to change the terminology. And finally, Mike, you have excellently described it, and I guess that our friend, ambassador from the embassy UK, he didn't mean to imply that this is the first step into Brexit, you know, which we have. And I saw it. This is already opening a new space, a new era in the old emballage, you know. And I think that we should be aware of it. Nobody, as you said, nobody is accusing here countries also, but we are free to discuss such things. And I think it's quite worrying what's happening with the private monies which are buying the politics and the justice. I think we should fight it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And there are too many agendas behind. You know, we never discuss that. You know, we just we all have learned and adopted a special wording. You know, on this, especially in this international world. You know, so. I myself was a long time, you know, at the OSCE and working on that, so I know quite well, you know, and this terminology is not really helpful, you know, so therefore we have another format, and that's fine to address it, and nobody is accused, but we would put it on the table, and everybody has also the possibility to contradict, to say something, to add something, whatever, yeah? Susanne, please.
Thank you. My name is Suzanne Hoff. I work for La Strade International, an umbrella network of NGOs. 28 NGOs are linked to it. First of all, thanks very much, Mike, but also all the other speakers, because it's very good food for thought, and it's an issue that we NGOs, as also mentioned by some here already, is an issue of concern for us, but also an issue of we don't really know how to react. Of course, NGOs do also not always agree, and some say maybe modern slavery or the term is more easy for the general public to understand. At the same time, we see a lot of harm. And definitely, and I think a lot of people have said it already, we very much wonder how it helps us in our daily work, because actually we see a lot of bad things happening. We see actually the reflection period not longer being really offered. I mean, residence permits are hardly given. Compensation is still very difficult to get granted. So even the things that are in the anti-trafficking legislation and are agreed are not implemented. And actually all of us said this already. So I very much would like to thank you also for raising it and to discuss it further. Secondly, we also wonder how these figures help us, because we all know that the actual people that we do assist are so little, and actually there's so little figures. I think it's 10,000 annually at the European Union, at the European level. Then you even doubt that we maybe only see 1%. So how does this enormous high level of estimates, how does it help us in reality, if already now there's not much support to grant the people that are identified, which is only 1%, to really assist them in practice. So these are two worries. Lastly, what I would like to say, I think it gave us very good insight in how politics work, how marketing works, and now we are all confronted with it. But lastly, what also surprised me a lot is that it's so much different within the UN. So it's all the different UN bodies saying different stuff. So not even the UN General Assembly supports its own definition on trafficking and allows this all to happen, which is also worries me at the much lower level, is how we then deal with this. So that's my...
Thank you very much. Okay, now perhaps I ask the panel to respond. Maybe first, Mike, or last? What do you think? No, maybe first. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, could we? Yeah, last. Okay, so then I would start with Uli.
Maybe there was. You hear me? Yeah. Maybe there was a little bit of misunderstanding about this. What I said about keeping the victims out of the criminal trial. This was just from the perspective of evidence, and not as victims demanding compensation in trial and being represented there by a lawyer, by a social worker, etc. So I'm completely with you that they should be in the trial as victims, but we should be very careful if it's on victims as witnesses, and if this is just the only piece of evidence we have. So if there is no other evidence, of course we have to do it with them. But as I told you before, I mean, in general, witness evidence is not a very proper piece of evidence at all. Yeah? If you ever had a trial dealing with a car accident, asking people what color this car had 7 months ago, yeah, you will have all answers you can imagine, and what direction this car came, and in what speed the car came. So you can choose everything, and so it's here the same. I mean, we all know about perception and consciousness, and so victim statements are not really reliable at all, and especially in these cases, due to the reasons I told before. So if there is no other evidence, we have to deal with it. And if it's just being present as victim, claiming compensation in court, 100% with you. Yeah.
Thank you. Jutta, please.
Yeah, thank you. Some of you asked, what about child victims? I'd like to refer it first to that, Mrs. Shams Asadi and you, Adina. I can tell that the Federal Ministry of Family and Women in Germany has drafted a cooperation concept, especially due to human trafficking concerning child victims, which means a cooperation concept and a device for the authorities how to deal with that. And this is newly drafted, as you know, so we have to see and what will happen. And I think raising awareness has been done the last years. So what you mentioned is really absolutely necessary. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Fabrizio?
Yes, just very quickly on the numbers. As far as our global report on trafficking persons is concerned, this was your question. Our data, I will be very brief, but our unit of analysis is the victims that have been detected. So we base our analysis on, we have a global database with 200,000 victims that have been detected by national authorities at local level. So we collect information from the authorities, the police forces or the prosecutor office in Germany, but also NGOs that are assisting victims in Mongolia and or the Ministry of Justice from South Africa. So we collect all this information and the profile of the victims, and these victims have been detected by some institution, whether the institution is state, but also sometimes we have NGOs or sometimes we have data from international organization. And the profiles that we describe refers to the profile of these victims that have been detected. So as I said, we have a database with 200,000 victims detected globally over the last 15 years. As far as the estimates, I will not enter so much in the work of other organizations. The point is, you probably have noticed if you read the global report that we resisted the temptation to come up with estimates because we believe there is not at the moment a definition or methodology to estimate number of victims of trafficking at global level. Maybe in some years, maybe in 10 years there will be such a methodology, but at the moment we believe the methodology is not there. So, and I limit my comments here.
Okay, thank you. So Mike, you're the last one, and you have a bunch of questions and comments to answer, to clarify, please.
And thank you everybody, and I'm very pleased we have someone from the UK mission who could clarify some of the points there. Let me repeat, as former director of an organization called Anti-Slavery, and as someone who personally feels a huge commitment to the need to prevent anything that is linked to slavery or extreme exploitation, let me repeat that my worry is about the agenda behind the use of this term. My concern is that people now caricatured as philanthro-capitalists, people like Bill Gates, but in this case Andrew Forrest, various others, have obtained too much power over issues that they understand too little. So they introduce their personal prejudices because they have the power to do so. It's not that they're slave masters, but they're using the same tradition, the hierarchy of power and influence. Now, it's 10 years ago that I was editor of a volume called Collateral Damage, criticizing the harm caused by anti-trafficking initiatives that were poorly thought through. And so I am equally concerned about the collateral damage of either anti-slavery initiatives or anti-child exploitation initiatives. And in a sense, the problem always is that a concept is half developed, moved into a political arena, given to some operational people, all without being thought through properly. So for those of you who were in Vienna 20 years ago, please register. I thought you did bad work when you developed the UN Protocol on Trafficking. I won't take time to talk about numbers because it could take all day, and I am not a statistician. But it hasn't been helpful. When I started work on this issue as a staff member in anti-slavery in 1995, I was horrified because I found my organization was claiming there were 100 million slaves in the world, but it had no evidence base. So I was very pleased when this academic I mentioned called Kevin Bales came along in 1997 and said, no, I've analyzed the world's newspaper cuttings, it's 12.7 million. Okay, so it seemed actually a somewhat more realistic number to play with. I was very concerned when the ILO director in the early part of this century said to his staff, we can't have an NGO or an American academic from Mississippi, Mr. Bales, telling us how many slaves there are in the world. We, the International Labour Office, must do the work and find out. And so they produced another, I can't remember whether it's 12 million to begin with, but they started their estimates. And we jump around with numbers. Now, numbers are important in some respects. In the 1990s, I was fairly deeply involved in what was going on in Sudan, where people were being abducted, and we had one organization claiming 100,000 people were in slavery in parts of what is now northern Sudan. And the problem with this, which was an exaggeration, maybe by a factor of 10, but it wasn't false. There were a lot of people who'd been abducted and were effectively in slavery. The problem with it is that if you greatly exaggerate a number or greatly underestimate a number, then the solution, the remedy you put in place is not appropriate. And very often at the moment, we have that problem. What is needed is much better research methodologies at national level. And then in the case, let's say, of the United Kingdom, where they think they've developed that, to back that up at the operational level. I can remember being somewhat appalled to come back from a meeting of a UN trust fund where I was a trustee, where we hadn't had a contribution from the United Kingdom a few years ago, only to hear the Minister of Foreign Affairs announce that he thought there were between 10 and 15,000 people in modern slavery in my own country. And I thought, well, at that point, you haven't put your money where your foot is. Now the money is there, but where is it going? Well, 25 million pounds to the Global Fund, which is essentially to back up a branch of US foreign policy that already tries to dominate the world of anti-trafficking. The model of philanthro-capitalists, successful business people like Andrew Forrest, is to obtain a monopoly and to squeeze out others. And that's what is happening at the moment. Of course, as was suggested, if people are in slavery or subjected to servitude or forced labor, it's vital to recognize what they are. At the same time, there are very few trafficked people in Europe who come forward to say, I am a slave or I was a slave. The whole question of how people self-identify is very relevant. Most who are trafficked don't self-identify as I am a trafficked person. And I hesitate to even open up all the confusions that have been caused by this poorly developed definition of trafficking, yet alone of modern slavery. What is needed for convictions is appropriate and tight definitions of very specific forms of exploitation. The one on trafficking is not adequate. I'm amazed you can convict anybody, actually. Something like servitude is poorly defined. Most jurisdictions in Europe haven't got there yet. We had a lovely case reach a judgment in the European Court on Human Rights earlier this year, where, in effect, the European Court judges were saying that a slate of Greek justices should be sacked for their irresponsible judgments concerning a group of Bangladeshi agricultural workers in Greece, strawberry workers. We have some very good jurisprudence, but we have also still in national law and national jurisprudence some appalling lacks. Of course, as we go forward and get tighter definitions of servitude or of bonded labor or of debt bondage or of forced labor, we can make progress. But we need much more than just a loose definition of trafficking in human beings. And then we need a clear message to the public. My big worry is that moving from trafficking to slavery, instead of clarifying, just confuses. And indeed, I'll go back and say the problem with the word trafficking is that a lot of the public still thinks it's to do with crossing the road and being knocked over by cars. So there is really a need for clarity. And it's not difficult. But unfortunately, the United Nations hasn't been very good at solving the problems. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all very much, but I would especially thank this panel, and we are a bit behind schedule, but it really doesn't matter. It's important that you find it interesting, that we discuss it. We have a break. If you could manage to be back in some 20 minutes, let's say 10 to 12, that's fine. And be aware, just take something, coffee, etc. Be aware, because we have a next provocative panel, you know, on the issue. Please.